Hello and welcome. I'm excited to dig into session 7 of our Introduction to Jungian Typology. Today we're going to be looking at the IJs, and these are the so-called introverted judging types. I say so-called because it's not quite so simple. Actually, the IJ types we're going to be looking at, which we're calling introverted judging types, they are types that are introverted that then have an extroverted judging function above any extroverted perceiving function. That is the technical definition in Myers-Briggs. So that is to say, introverted perceiving dominant with auxiliary judging. And I know that's kind of a mouthful. It's kind of a technical way to describe it. I kind of went back and forth on this, and I wondered if maybe I shouldn't really call them introverted judging types because it's kind of a misnomer. You can see I actually went ahead with introverted judging types at the end of the day because I figured it would be a good opportunity to look at the confusion that often arises in Myers-Briggs circles. If you tell somebody you're an introverted judging type, do they assume you're an IJ, which is what we're looking at here, the IJs, or do they assume you're an IP? Because the IPs have a dominant introverted judging function. So it's a little bit complex, and I thought about calling this, the IJs rather than the introverted judging types, but I think it actually is fine as long as we understand that we are talking within the context of the Myers-Briggs stack, where an IJ type is a type that has a dominant introverted perceiving function with an auxiliary extroverted judging function. And in any case, I guess you could say these are types that are introverts and that show their judgments to the world, although they're actually a lot less judgmental than you would imagine. Compared to an IP, who's an introvert who hides their judgments and keeps them internally and shows their perceptions to the world, right? They're an IP, an introverted perceiving type. That is to say, they're introverted and they show their perceptions, but they hide their judgments. So either way, we will go along with this nomenclature, and it will become clear if it's not clear now, this distinction. Now, I also wanted to take the opportunity here before we dig into the introverted judging types, the IJs, to just review what we've seen so far. Because we've covered a lot of ground, and it's nice to review. It's nice to have like a rinse, repeat kind of thing here. And so you'll see my first part of the review is just to kind of start where we began with the distinction between perceiving versus judging, which is also known from the objective personality system, which is kind of one of the leading offshoots of Jungian typology, as the distinction between observing versus deciding. So perception, observation, pretty clear, and then judgment is also, it has an element of deciding, which is maybe less clear, but kind of an interesting association there. So I am an IJ, so I'm an introverted judging type from one perspective, because I'm an introvert that extroverts my judgments, and yet I am a dominant perceiving type, because I am introverted intuitive. And so perceiving is about things more than people, perceiving the world of things, and as a process manager, either managing processes through taking action or through tracking and organizing. And that really depends on whether perception is introverted or extroverted. Today we'll be looking at IJs. So these are people who are process managers who track and organize. They have a bias against action. Every IJ type, that is to say the INFJ, the INTJ, the ISFJ, the ISTJ, has difficulty taking action, or the action is somewhat unconscious, autonomous, because their inferior function is going to be an extroverted perceiving function that's more about taking action. They're going to prefer to track and organize. So it's much easier for me to take information and organize it and categorize it and track things and sort of manage the process that way by weighing many factors and by looking at different possible outcomes and so on, and basically using my introverted perceiving function, my introverted intuition, as a process manager to sort of check in and see if I'm reaching my goals and see if there's anything that I should change and kind of just continually check in, this internally checking in. If I were an extroverted sensing type or an extroverted intuitive, I would have more of a bias for action, right? So then those are the perceiving types they're also checking, but they're not checking internally, they're checking externally. These two forms of process management are both open-ended. One prefers to plan and refer to an internal roadmap to continually course correct. That would be my case. The other prefers to have an immediate feedback loop of cause and effect with the outside world, and that would be the extroverted sensing and the extroverted intuitive types. So just to kind of begin with, we started this whole thing with the Kantian distinction between perceiving versus judging. Now we're going to be looking at IJ types today, which are dominant perceiving types. Confusingly, perhaps. Now, the judging types, judging is about closing loops and putting an end to things, eliminating the need for future process management. It is more people-oriented and is either passively measuring and comparing as information comes in, that would be the introverted judging functions, or it is trying to communicate and hook into the other person's logical or emotional faculties, in the case of the extroverted judging functions. Perceiving is divided into sensing and intuition. Sensing is concerned with facts, basically sensory, the sensory world, things that are kind of can be proven or demonstrated or have some bearing in the physical world, something more physical. And intuition is more concerned with patterns and emergent meanings from those facts. Yes, we have the facts, but how should we interpret them? This is an intuitive question, very introspective question. The sensing type will either organize sense impressions into an inner living journal, that would be the introverted sensing type, or they will prefer to take direct action in the outer world and witness the feedback. That's the extroverted sensing type. They learn kinesthetically, they learn by doing, they learn physically, and they learn through a feedback loop where they can take an action and see what its repercussions are in a sort of empathetic kind of union with the outside world. The intuiting type will either organize their intuitions into a living journal, but this time one that tracks realizations, assumptions, beliefs, or they will prefer to take action in the outer world and see what happens, like the sensing type, but often with an intuitive leap of logic that crosses contexts. That would be the extroverted intuitive. So just to kind of get where we are so far, these are our basic definitions: perceiving versus judging, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, and then, as we saw before, the introverted and extroverted attitudes of the functions. Judging is divided into thinking and feeling, both of which are humanist, but one appealing to formula and logic, while the other appeals to what could be termed more generally reason, including more humanist qualities like ethics and aesthetics. That being said, the thinking type will be the one to appeal more to their reasons for things, whereas the feeling type may appeal to what is appropriate. One note here is that we should not say that feeling is unreasonable. In fact, when somebody says be reasonable, they often are appealing to the feeling function, because the feeling function is what can weigh and kind of judge, is this reasonable or not? The thinking function is really more going to judge, is this going to work or not, in the extroverted, or is this logically sound or not, in the introverted. So the thinking is going to catch logical flaws, or they're going to figure out where something logistically may be an issue, but they're not necessarily going to appeal to, please be reasonable, be merciful, be generous, be hospitable, be kind. Those are all feeling things. But both of them are quite humanist, which is kind of funny. Some people think of the thinking function as somewhat robotic or not human. I'm here to tell you the feeling function can be just as robotic. Any function can be just as robotic. But thinking and feeling are actually both very human functions. They're more about people than about things. Thinking is divided into the passive security guard that looks for logical fallacies as information is taken in, the introverted thinking, or the more active, eloquent communicator who does their best to transmit information to the other effectively and with commitment to remain unbiased, and that's the extroverted thinking. Feeling is divided into the inner conscience that checks if things sit right and is capable of evaluating and reevaluating in order to give more or less importance to the opinions of others based on how well they match up to one's inner standard. That's the introverted feeling function. Or, on the other hand, an extroverted side which is capable of hooking into others' emotional states and motivating them. The extroverted feeling type. Introversion and extroversion are two attitudes, Jung's term, that determine the flow of libido, either from self to object or from object to self. If you have an introverted dominant function, your inferior function is extroverted. If you have an extroverted dominant function, your inferior function is introverted. Now, the one thing that we haven't really covered as much yet, and I realized when we were diving into Myers-Briggs that it would just be helpful. We kind of maybe touched on this, but just looking at temperament, at Kiersey's temperaments, temperament is an emergent property of the combination of one perceiving function with one judging function. There are 4 temperaments: sensing thinking, sensing feeling, intuitive thinking, and intuitive feeling. However, David Kiersey also discovered 4 basic temperaments, which he named the guardian, artisan, rational, and idealist. Later, this was matched up to the SJ, SP, NT, and NF categories of the Myers-Briggs system. So I don't want to go too fast here, but this is just a way of kind of, in case we want to look at things through a Kierseyan lens, Kiersey really saw humanity's psyche as divided naturally into 4 fundamental temperaments, and these 4 fundamental temperaments do correlate to different types, like all of the SJs, like the ESTJ, the ISFJ, and so on. All 4 SJs were considered guardians because their combination of introverted sensing with extroverted judging is all about I guess the introverted sensing is like guarding traditions from the past, guarding inner standards that have been developed over time and customs and all of these things. And the way they do that is through their extroverted judging function, which is sharing their judgments to others. The artisan type, that was associated with the SP. So this would be the ESTP, the ESFP, the ISTP, the ISFP. These were considered artisans because what they have in common is an extroverted perceiving function that it happens to be sensing, and that is kind of what they show the world, that their first extroverted function is sensing. So really we could see in the case of the SJs, these are very much introverted sensing people, so they're very organized and they're very referencing of their internal data and internal state, their internal course correction of how they think things should be. They're very prescriptive. The outer world should match my inner organization. And then on the other hand, we have the SPs, where their extroverted sensing kind of shows that they're more typically caricatured as lovers of life and bon vivants and so on. And of course, we have to be a little careful with those caricatures, but if you look at people of these types, you'll find a lot of SPs that are in fields that are very sense-oriented, very sensual, cooking, things like that. Now, NT and NF became the rational and idealist temperaments, and so it's kind of funny that it's like SJ, SP, NT, NF. It's kind of an interesting... 2 of these are not like the others, right? But the NT and NF, Kiersey calls rationals and idealists, and this is really just to say that the ENTP, the INTJ, the ENTJ, the INTP, these NT types are highly rational, and I kind of disagree because I also see feeling as rational, and there's no feeling in those types, I mean, there's no feeling types represented in the rationals, but I see why Kiersey called them rational, because if we imagine by rational a sort of a Poindexter philosopher, Kantian figure, Kant is often thought to be an INTP. So these kind of NT people who believe in the use of reason above all else, and particularly the thinking flavor of reason. Because as mentioned, feeling can be quite reasonable, but thinking is going to appeal to logical fallacies or logistical issues. So it's either going to say this is correct or incorrect because it's logically sound or not, or this is correct or incorrect because it works or not, basically. So this is really just to kind of set the context so that we can include Kiersey when we want to. And in brief, we have the types here. We have the guardian types, the SJs, the artisan types, the SPs, the rational NT types, and the idealist NF types. Now, this isn't really the whole story, because when you get into the subtypes and the more advanced Jungian typology, such as objective personality, what you find is you can have the INTJ type code, which actually happens to be my type code in Myers-Briggs. However, my dominant temperament is NF because of my subtype. So you actually kind of have to be a little careful with assuming that because somebody is an ENFJ, they're going to be NF. They could actually also be SF, which looks a lot more like an artisan, right? Or they could appear, an ISTP could actually look more like an ISTJ sometimes, depending on their subtype. Things like that. So there can be some complexities there. So to review, the Myers-Briggs system delineates 16 types that follow the formula for a cognitive function stack of the dominant function, the auxiliary function, which is the opposite dominant function attitude, the tertiary, which is the same as the dominant function attitude, and the inferior, which is once again the opposite. So it kind of has this mismatch, like introverted, extroverted, introverted, extroverted. It kind of alternates. The Myers-Briggs function stack is worth studying, even though we now know with subtypes that it's not quite so simple. For instance, an ENTJ can have the following function stack: extroverted thinking, introverted intuition, and so on, while being either NT or ST dominant and preferring any of these possible temperament pairs. I know this is a little bit complex, so we'll just kind of touch on it. This is more just caution so that when you learn these things, and especially if you're going to go deeper and really learn the subtypes, you don't assume that the type code naturally implies a particular dominant temperament. Due to this complexity, it is important to study the Myers-Briggs cognitive function stack as a level of structure of the psyche without assuming temperament from that structure. So I'm an INTJ. One level of the structure of my psyche is dominant introverted intuition with secondary extroverted thinking. However, when we get into subtypes, we'll see that I'm actually an NF subtype. So I'm actually more preferring my introverted intuition with my introverted feeling. And it's only after I've gone through that digestive process that I can then present my judgments to others through my extroverted thinking, as I'm doing right now here with you. Extroverted thinking is often can kind of seem as a running narrative of the inner thought process of the person. Just as extroverted feeling could be the inner emotional process of the person being externalized, kind of thinking aloud or feeling aloud. As we go through each of the 16 Myers-Briggs types, we will point out how this type would operate with a classic subtype, where the temperament perfectly matches the cognitive function stack, as well as offer the range of expression we may see of other temperaments. So that's kind of one of my goals here, even though we're still at the introductory level. When I talk about these types, I'm going to kind of explain them in a classic way and then talk a little bit about the range and breadth that you might see in these types. Reminder: a perceiving type in Myers-Briggs is someone who has an extroverted perceiving function higher in their stack than their extroverted judging function. A judging type is the opposite. So whether someone's called perceiving or judging in Myers-Briggs is based on which extroverted function is higher. And so again, this is kind of what I touched on earlier. Today we're going to be looking at IJ types where they have a higher extroverted judging function than their perceiving function. All right, so let's take a look at the types now. The first two types we're going to look at are the ISTJ and the ISFJ. And I'll read from some little blurbs momentarily, but I just want to first, I want to kind of bring in just the notion of what the dominant function here is. What is the dominant introverted sensing? And dominant introverted sensing, as we looked at before, can be seen as this finely tuned photographic plate absorbing sensory impressions. It can be seen as someone who is organizing their memories and sense impressions in a sort of inner encyclopedia or inner journal. So introverted sensing types often are very good at remembering people's names and families and so on. We can't generalize, I mean, fully. We're just talking in trend. One of the patterns we see is that a lot of introverted sensing types have an easy time remembering what they had for breakfast the previous day or the day before or the day before. Also because they often tend to be very habitual with a sort of bias to repeat the same task rather than do something new. So the introverted sensing has this sort of bias for familiarity, bias for routine. In Myers-Briggs communities is often seen as boring, although it really isn't. It's actually a really interesting function because, as Jung said, it has a deep connection to the ancestral past and to tradition and heritage and things like that. So a lot of introverted sensing types can get into anything from the natural sciences to anthropology to studying cultural heritage and things like that. It really is an interesting function that is really underappreciated in Jungian and Myers-Briggs circles because it's seen as somehow boring, right? It's kind of just seen, I mean, even the idea from Kiersey that these are the guardians who protect cultural tradition and so on. It's kind of like, who wants to be a guardian? Don't you want to be an extroverted sense type? An extroverted sense kind of the extroverted sensing is way more adaptable and open and flexible and all of these things. And the introverted sensing can seem really rigid and so on. It doesn't have to be. I mean, there are some subtypes that are going to be a lot less rigid in this area. But just to kind of start with this idea that the introverted sensing type, that they're fundamentally organizing things and tracking things, kind of keeping track of them and putting them into a cohesive narrative or a cohesive sequence of events that such that even though they may be fragmentary, because there is a sort of fragmentary aspect of introverted sensing, unlike extroverted sensing, which has a more holistic aspect of getting the whole thing. The introverted sensing kind of selects from it and extracts from it and is sort of, in that sense, a little more impressionistic and a little more subjective. But despite that, it still does build a sequence insofar as the introverted sense type has some notion of kind of what they did and, oh, first I went here and then I went there and then this happened and then I had this for lunch and then I went to work and then at work this happened and then it's like this kind of inner living journal of sensory experience. And the other thing is when they access this journal, it's full of even an affective charge. It's full of an almost emotional charge, like remembering their first kiss, remembering the first time they ate a certain meal or the first time they went on a hot air balloon or, what it felt like to go on that roller coaster. All of these different memories that sort of contain within them the juice of the memory in a way that other types might have a harder time accessing, that other types can't actually just go into that so easily. So these are just some of the ways we can approach introverted sensing. And then also because I do want to bring in John Beebe, and again, I think he's somebody that we will probably look at further in depth, but John Beebe has some really nice keynotes. And so he describes that the heart of the process of introverted sensing is verifying. And these are people who are always verifying. It's like verifying that we're making the right choice, verifying we're on track. It's like I just got back from the Texas Eclipse Festival, and I went with an introverted sensing type, and he checked the oil like 8 times. Like every time we got to a gas station, he would clean off the windows and check the oil. There's a lot of maintenance, a lot of upkeep, a lot of making sure and verifying and checking things. He checked the fans. He checked some belts. I mean, he knew all these different things to check that I didn't even think to check. Now, the introverted intuitive, which is my type, we also verify in a sense, in some way. We also verify. We verify that it matches our internal model of reality, basically. But we don't verify in the way that, checking the oil to make sure that the oil's good, something like that. So that's a really nice keynote from Beebe. Now, the persona is implementing. So for Beebe, he says these SI people are very good at implementing things. And the implementing has a goal of accounting. So again, it's kind of a wonder why, maybe it's no wonder why people in the Myers-Briggs world say SI is a boring function and a lot of people don't want to have it. It's not boring. None of the functions are boring. It's just that when people hear about verifying and checking and accounting and stuff, their eyes kind of glaze over, unless they're introverted sensing types, in which case it's actually quite a magical thing. I mean, there was accounting in ancient Egypt. There was accounting in ancient China. You can have a connection to an archetypal role like being an accountant, and it can actually be really magical and really incredible and interesting and not at all boring. But from the outside, it might look boring. So the introverted sensing types for BB, they're about verifying, and they will implement with the goal of accounting. And that's kind of some of the keynotes he uses. And for the ISFJ and the ISTJ, BB says this is about recognition of the natural order of things. So recognition of the natural order. It's basically, that's perhaps why these can be such great naturalists. There's a lot of great naturalist scientists who are introverted sensing types. And there's this recognition of the natural order and sort of accounting and verifying and checking and documenting. I mean, an introverted sensing scientist who wants to document all the different flora and fauna of a region would typically be an introverted sensing lead. Okay, so that's the BB. That's the view from BB. And let's take a look now at, these are a couple excerpts from Introduction to Myers-Briggs Type by Isabel Briggs Myers. And about the ISTJ, quiet, serious, earn success by being thorough and dependable, practical, matter of fact, realistic and responsible. Decide logically what should be done. Take pleasure in making everything orderly and organized. Value traditions and loyalty. So this is, again, maybe an example of kind of how this type can be caricatured as boring, right? Because it's like everything should be orderly and organized, taking pleasure in making things organized. Like, I'm going to organize my sock drawer. Yay! I'm not going to go out and be irresponsible. So, I mean, there definitely is a responsibility here. The quiet, serious, earn success by being thorough, dependable. Well, okay, these may be true of certain subtypes of the ISTJ, but now we know, having had 100 years of Jungian typology now, we're in 2024, so 101 years since the English translation of psychological types. Now we know that there are a lot of subtypes of ISTJ. There are ISTJs that look way more intuitive, way more feeling, way more thinking side. It's just kind of, it's like, it's really, there's like the pure ISTJ that's going to be like this extremely orderly person. Then there's going to be ISTJs that have relatively higher capacity to adapt and handle chaos, or they're more on the thinking side or more on the feeling side and this and that. So we can't generalize too much here. But I think we can also try to get to the essence behind what Isabel Briggs Myers is saying here. Practical, matter of fact, realistic, responsible. These are introverted sensory traits. All sensing might be practical and matter of fact and realistic, more or less. However, introverted sensing is very responsible. Extroverted sensing might want to do some Evel Knievel stunt on a motorcycle. Maybe he's not that responsible, actually. So the introverted side is kind of it's actually what they have in common with the INJs, like myself. In fact, if we were to read this description for me, some of it is actually true. I am fairly serious. I do earn success by being thorough and dependable. I am quite practical, but I also have a lot of impractical ideas, and maybe that's where the intuition comes in. I'm not so matter-of-fact, because I might say, well, yes, those are the facts, but let's imagine what else could happen and how we might use these facts or how we might interpret things differently. Deciding logically what should be done. I don't know if that applies to the ISTJ as much as Isabel Briggs Myers maybe thinks it does, because again, she was in a time where they were probably mistyping a lot of the subtypes because the subtypes weren't really known. So if there was like a really emotionally mature, feeling-oriented, like double feeling activated, I guess would be the technical term in a more advanced Jungian modality, I don't know that they would have been typed as an ISTJ. They probably would have been called an ISFJ or something different. So now we kind of have a more advanced understanding of Jungian type to the point we can see that there are all of these different subtypes, and some ISTJs look a lot more feeling and so on. They're still ISTJs. But I guess I would just say that I don't think they all decide logically what should be done. I think it's just looking at what could be done and then referencing this inner journal of what happened in the past and potentially expecting the same thing in the future that happened in the past, even if there isn't a lot to warrant that. Like maybe there's going to be a bias. Here's one way of describing it, is that the introverted sensing type may have more of a bias to, I guess you could say, expect things not to change, whereas the INTJ and the INFJ may expect things to change more, And so the INTJ, INFJ might have a harder time accepting defeat because they keep thinking they have a way to rescue victory from the jaws of defeat using their intuition, kind of superior intuition over inferior sensing, is kind of the idea. Whereas the ISTJ and ISFJ, they have superior sensing over inferior intuition, so they're not going to really trust something untested that's never happened before. They're not going to necessarily expect it to work. They're going to more look at what happened in the past and probably be skeptical of what goes against that. Okay, the ISFJ is described as orderly and harmonious, quiet, friendly, responsible, conscientious, thorough, painstaking, and accurate, loyal, considerate. They notice and remember specifics about people who are important to them. They are steady and they meet their obligations. So, yeah, I mean, this is pretty similar to the ISTJ, and I think that some of the differences are actually not exclusive to ISTJ or ISFJ here. Like, the differences that Isabel Briggs-Myers gets at are more the differences between thinking versus feeling. But what we now know with the subtypes is that for an introverted sensing type, there's going to be a lot of thinking subtypes and feeling subtypes, regardless if they're ISTJ or ISFJ. There's not really a meaningful difference between them. What the difference is what they show to the outer world. The ISTJs are going to show their reasons to the outer world. They're going to think aloud. They're going to show their work. They're going to explain why they did it. There is actually one subtype of ISTJ that really hates explaining, so even that we shouldn't generalize too much about. But if you can get them to explain it, they will explain it by showing their thought process in the same way that I do. There's a sort of a transparency of the thought process, a thinking aloud, where the extroverted thinking is talking and explaining and kind of trying to hook into the other's understanding by showing reasons. Here's why we do this, that's why we do that. First I do this before that, because if I do it after, that will happen. And so it's all of this kind of logistical stuff, right? The extroverted thinking, logistical stuff. Meanwhile, the ISTJ is going to hide their feelings. They're going to hide what they like and dislike. They're going to maybe hide if they have a problem with something internally and keep that to themselves, or maybe they even really like you, but they don't want to tell you that because they're not, it's like none of your business, It's kind of, they keep their feelings to themselves. They will readily share their thought process. Then we look at the ISFJ, and the ISFJ, it's the opposite. They're hooking into other people's feelings. So they are checking basically how you feel. They're saying something, and then because they have extroverted feeling, they're watching your facial expression after they say it, so that if they say, "Are you okay with this?" and you say, "Yeah, of course," they look at your facial expression to kind of see, are you really okay with it? Did you not like that? And they're going to be more aware of when people are excluded from groups, things like that, because their extroverted feeling function is trying to see what other people like and dislike, what other people respect or not. This person is admired, this person is loathed, this person is respected, this person is ignored. And they're going to kind of be aware of that and oftentimes study others' facial expressions and reactions in a way that the ISTJ might find, or anyone that has introverted feeling might find almost offensive or disingenuous. Like I'm an introverted feeler, and if I say, "Hey, do you want to get lunch?" and you go, "Yeah, sure," I just accept that at face value because you told me you want to get lunch. But an ISFJ or anyone with extroverted feeling might say, you want to get lunch? And you go, yeah, sure. And they kind of look at you to see, do you really want to? And I mean, you could look at it in a way as you can make the negative, you can paint it negative, you can paint it positive. It's really however you want to look at that. The positive is they actually care. The negative is it can be a little bit manipulative or a little bit contrived. If introverted feeling is so concerned with my authentic subjective feelings and what I consider so real to me, even if it's not real to anybody else, but I almost universalize and project the reality of my feelings out onto the world, at least there's some sort of authenticity implied here of the authenticity of someone truly feels this. But the extroverted feeling type isn't checking how they feel. The extroverted feeling type, they're checking how you feel, right? They might check what they think, which is a little bit different. They might check their reasons for something, but they're not necessarily checking how they feel. They're more curious how you feel. And, it can be very heartfelt, but it can also be very contrived. It can be so that they can gain an advantage from that because they may have an advantage if they know how that person feels. I know that, von Franz, for instance, talked about how the extroverted feeling type, or people that have high extroverted feeling in their stack, like an ISFJ typically would, at least in a more conventional subtype, that these extroverted feeling types, they can really be the life of the party, and they can cheer you up, and they can be so encouraging and validating, and they can tell you how wonderful it is to see you, and they really mean it. That there is no contrivance, there's no insincerity, they 100% mean it. They're so excited to see you, although excitement is actually not a word we use to describe extroverted feeling much. You will find when you start to dig in more to the distinction between introverted, and maybe you've already found, that the introverted feeling types can be a little bit excitable to the point of seeming naive, while the extroverted feeling types tend to be a little more world-weary, jaded, cynical, and so on. But, they might not really be as excited. But in any case, it would be really unfair to characterize extroverted feeling as merely this contrived way of trying to check how others feel and then use that to your advantage. It's not. So as von Franz says, they can tell you it's so wonderful to see you, and they really do mean it. And there's nothing contrived there. There's nothing manipulative there. It's simply true. However, if their feeling becomes a little automatic, becomes a little robotic, becomes a little, they become a little worn out, then, as von Franz puts it, she had an extroverted feeling type, in this case, extroverted feeling dominant, but tell her, my, what a wonderful day it is. And von Franz looked out and it was gray, and she thought, your dominant function is rattling. You need to rest, and then it'll come back in its full strength. But there's this idea that extroverted feeling normally is actually this great connector of people, and this great social glue, and this great encourager of sharing feelings together, and all of these really positive pro-social things. Really, the people with the inferior extroverted feeling tend to be the most antisocial in the kind of personality disorder sense of the term, right? Or just personality structure sense, I guess we could say, the more antisocial. But the extroverted feeling types are very pro-social, and so this pro-sociality does have a great benefit of gluing people together and lubricating, the social lubrication, getting the party going, putting people at ease, getting people not to take themselves so seriously, all of this stuff. That's what extroverted feeling can do. Well, in this case, it's not dominant. We're looking at the ISFJ, that, it can be secondary. And then we also know that based on subtypes, there are some ISFJs that really have a hard time with extroverted feeling, and it's actually not their inferior function, but the equivalent of the inferior function in subtyping, which is to say something they really have a difficulty with. So it is, not really fair to assume that an ISFJ will prefer feeling over thinking, but it is, of course, interesting to look at the difference between the extroverted versus the introverted feeling, as well as with thinking. Okay, so then let's take a look at the INFJ and the INTJ. So the INFJ and INTJ are both introverted intuitive types. I happen to be an INTJ. And I'm just going to read what BB has to say about introverted intuition. He calls it the knowing function. I agree, but I also see how there's a way that introverted sensing is also a knowing function. So I kind of call them both knowing functions. I just say that introverted intuition is here to kind of know in the philosophical sense, like how do you know, almost like to know ontologically, for those who study philosophy, which would mean to know not only what you've observed, but what assumptions you've made, to be aware of your ontological commitments, to kind of know in an intuitive sense. And, it is true that we know about a lot of things too, like introverted intuitives just know a lot. So I see why BB called it knowing, and he calls introverted sensing verifying. But I will say, when I went on my trip with my introverted sensing friend, we talked for hours and hours in a road trip. We talked about chemistry and neuroscience and physics, quantum mechanics. And I mean, it is amazing how much introverted sensing types know. I am always blown away by the encyclopedic knowledge of ISTJs and ISFJs. I happened to go on a trip with an ISFJ, but this ISFJ had incredible knowledge of the natural world and incredible knowledge of climate science and weather systems and all of these things. So it's not really fair to say that the introverted sensing type is not a knowing function. I think it's just more that what kinds of things they want to know are, I won't even say that they only want to know facts, but because they are very systems oriented too. I mean, I think there's a lot of confusion in Jungian circles that the introverted intuitives, the INFJs and the INTJs, are the systems people, and the ISTJs and the ISFJs are somehow like simplistic or something. No, it's nothing simple about it. Each function is incredibly complex, believe me. Maybe that's just me being an INTJ. I always loved when Mencken said, for every complex problem, there is a solution that is simple, elegant, and absolutely wrong. The world is a complex place. Let's not oversimplify. But the introverted sensing types, they're absolutely systems thinkers because they're interested in ecosystems such as how the weather systems interact with the local flora and fauna and how humans interact with their and different cultural traditions meet, and all of these very complex systems effects. It's just more that the systems effects they're more interested in are things they can verify or validate scientifically and essentially prove physically. And the introverted intuitive, what we're looking at here, the INFJ and the INTJ, like myself, are far more comfortable. In fact, it's almost a game to us to take a very small amount of information and then see how much we can extrapolate from that. Like, one of my favorite games is to just try to guess somebody's type knowing very little about them. I had an INFJ friend, and we would watch people walk down the street, and based on how they walked and what they were wearing and kind of how they carried themselves, we would try to guess their personality type. We would guess their Enneagram. We would guess all sorts of things, and then later try to verify it in our own way. So when BB says that introverted sensing is verifying and introverted intuition is knowing, okay, sure, but we also do each other's job too. I also verify. Introverted intuitives also know a hell of a lot, or introverted sensing types also know a hell of a lot, rather. So it's basically knowing and verifying. It's kind of depends how you look at it. But I do understand why BB used that term, because introverted intuitives are often know-it-alls. You'll find quite a few know-it-alls. This is not a rule. There are exceptions to the rule. I mean, there are different subtypes that are much more receptive and open to others. But a lot of introverted intuitives out there have an irrational confidence because they've essentially proven to themselves time and time again that they're able to make accurate predictions given very small amounts of information and actually impress the hell out of everyone, making them almost appear psychic. Like, how did you know that? How did you guess that? How did you know this would happen? I mean, we can imagine in the olden times, introverted intuitives could be like the seers and mystics and the shamans who were trusted because they were able to make accurate predictions. One of the ways I like to hear the description of introverted intuition from Dario Nardi, who's a neuroscience researcher who looks into cognitive neuroscience and personality, is that introverted intuition weighs many factors. So it's taking all these different factors and weighing them out and essentially trying to find a way to reach a certain outcome given particular constraints and weighing all of these different factors. And it's a very complex, big picture thing, using Jung's early description of sensing as sort of taking in one thing at a time, and then intuition as speeding it up until there's so much sensory input coming that you can't take it in one at a time. You can't see the trees. You start to see the forest. You start to see the patterns emerge. It's like the individual beats turn into a tone, and then suddenly there's a frequency and a tone, and that frequency can be interpreted and used, right? So the introverted intuitive is really far more comfortable speeding through the facts to get to the big picture, and the introverted sensing type is far more comfortable looking, kind of zooming in. It's like zooming in or zooming out. The ISTJs and the ISFJs out there, they're zooming in as far as you can go. The INFJs, the INTJs, they're zooming out as far as you can go. In some sense. In another sense, INTJs and INFJs also go very deep. And, as mentioned, introverted sensing types love to do that zoom out and understand how the different aspects of the ecosystem work together and so on. So I see both introverted sensing and introverted intuition as holistic systems thinkers, even though introverted sensing is often not included in that. So BB says the heart of the process of introverted intuition is knowing. Their persona is imagining, and the goal of the process is divining. This is what I love about BB. He doesn't shy away from it. He doesn't mince words. Divining, it's like a divining rod, like knowing where water is, right? Or divining in the sense of, even guessing somebody's personality type. Typing someone is a very introverted intuitive game. It's something introverted intuitives love. They love to take a little bit of information and then, guess from that. Now, I will say, just like introverted sensing, which is continually accumulating this ever accumulating living journal of their history and all of the information that they're kind of saving in it, introverted intuitives do the same thing. But the difficulty for the introverted intuitive is that they're constantly making predictions based on their current framework, and if their framework doesn't work, it's very hard for them to modify it a little bit. It's not like an extroverted intuitive that kind of has more of an adaptable quality. The introverted intuitive can be extremely resistant to modifying their system, because if they do, they almost have to tear it down and start over. So I can say personally that and also the most embarrassing thing for an introverted intuitive is like being wrong, because if your job is to know and you don't know, it's just humiliating, right? But I can happily report, I guess, or not so happily report, that for many, many years, I mistyped so many people because I didn't know the subtypes. So I was misunderstanding what I thought was sensing was actually just a masculine function or a feminine function or this or that. Not to go too technical into the subtypes, but when you get into subtyping, there's this idea of the masculine and feminine variants. And even just that level, I was kind of misinterpreting certain types, like something about sensing and thinking seemed more masculine, and something about intuition and feeling seemed more feminine. So if I had a masculine intuitive type, I would mistype them as sensing because I was misrecognizing what they were doing and kind of categorizing it wrong. And then because I'm an introverted intuitive, it took me years and years and years and years to correct this, because I was so resistant to change, and I was so like, I know. My job is to stay true to what I know and not be influenced by others. My job is to have really high defenses and not let others change what I know, basically. And that's something that I think a lot of introverted intuitives can relate to. Now, I'm happy to say that I have since developed a much richer, deeper understanding starting about 7 years ago. I mean, I've been doing, Jungian type 26 years now, 27 years. But starting around 7 years ago, I pretty much tore everything down to the base, bare bones, started over from scratch, built it all back up from the ashes, and now I'm, 7 or 8 years in on this iteration of my inner mental model. And I keep filling in that mental model, and I keep, basically kind of seeing what I know, and then based on what I know, how can I use what I know to extrapolate from that and come up with new assumptions and new conclusions and to know other things and so on. Now, Beebe says that the introverted intuitive lead people say that life must be filled in by my individual unconscious impressions. So that's basically the kind of fundamental belief of the introverted intuitive, that life must be filled in, that life is kind of missing something. And what we fill in, the missing data, is filled in through my own personal, highly subjective, highly individual impressions that are from my unconscious. So introverted intuition is almost like this direct line to the unconscious, where it can get all sorts of knowing without necessarily knowing how it knows it, because it's built this inner matrix it can run everything through. It's built this sort of inner structure and this inner living journal, just like introverted sensing does. But whereas with introverted sensing, you might ask them to remember something and they would kind of remember it and get the affective charge of the sensory impressions. For the introverted intuitive, what they do is they kind of cross-reference and play things against each other, like mentally modeling what would happen if these two people met. Let's imagine a conversation with this person and that person. What would happen if this weren't actually true, but it was actually that other way? And then playing it all out in their head. Now, again, some introverted intuitive types are going to have a harder time doing this, and they're going to be pulled more into the outer world, and some are going to be pulled more towards thinking or feeling. But, by and large, introverted intuitives have a real gift for envisioning, imagining, and so on, as do extroverted intuitives in a different way. Okay, so let's just see what Isabel Briggs-Myers has to say here. The INFJ, insightful, seek meaning and connection in ideas, relationships, and material possessions. Firm values, drawn to understand people, visionary, adept at developing a clear vision about how best to serve the common good, organized and decisive in implementing their vision. So, how best to serve the common good, the visionary stuff, all of this, it's very NF. This is very much like how Kiersey describes the idealists. And the fact is that INFJs can be NF temperament, but they can also be NT temperament, where there's other subtypes, right? And the INTJ, even though it might seem like they're NT, they can also be NF. So I actually am a intuitive feeling temperament INTJ. And if you come with me into the more advanced aspects of Jungian typology, we'll explore all of that nuance. But, it's not that this isn't true. It's just that some of what Isabel Briggs-Myers is saying is because probably if there was an INFJ who was it was a subtype that preferred their thinking, they would have been categorized as an INTJ, miscategorized as an INTJ. So the INFJ and the INTJ, really, the only real difference, again, just like we saw with the SI types, is whether their feeling is extroverted, whether their thinking is extroverted. So the INFJ is going to be way better at knowing how other people feel. They're going to be way more attuned to how others feel. They're going to be aware of who's excluded from the group, and they're going to be aware of group dynamics and group hierarchies and who's the alpha and who's being ignored and who's being paid attention to, and all of these kinds of things that they kind of look out to the world and they hook into other people's feeling functions. And an INFJ talking to you isn't going to use that extroverted thinking enunciated way that I'm talking. They're going to say, hey, great to see you. Wow, how have you been? And all that kind of stuff, and use that cooing quality. Or if they're really cold or not in a good mood, they'll say, yeah, okay, right, fine, and things like that, right? So there's going to be more emotional expressivity for the INFJ compared to the INTJ. Now, Isabel Briggs-Myers describes INTJs as original minds with a great drive for implementing their ideas and achieving their goals, quickly seeing patterns in external events and developing long-range explanatory perspectives. They have high standards, and they are skeptical and independent. Well, skeptical of others and what others know. Maybe they could stand to be a little more skeptical of what they themselves know. But I guess I would just say that these descriptions pretty equally match each other's type, like with equal validity. The difference being that she's kind of assuming the standard INFJ that is an NF type versus, she's assuming this INTJ is more of a thinking type. Now, I do agree that the extroverted thinking type has a drive for implementing ideas and achieving goals, because extroverted thinking is much more goal-oriented in the sense of using thinking to solve logistical problems. Like, extroverted thinking is going to think of ways to save money on something, or think of a way that we could be more efficient, or a way that we could do things in a different order, a better order of operations, things like that. The INFJ, they have introverted thinking, so they're going to be more attuned to when there's a logical fallacy or something that we're assuming is true that might not be true. They're going to actually be skeptical in their own way, but what they're going to be skeptical of is basically other people's reasons for things. They're going to want to see for themselves if their reasons or if their faculties of reason and sort of thinking agree. So that would be kind of one of the distinctions there. So yeah, I think just to kind of look at the INFJ and the INTJ, the real difference is whether they're showing their thinkings or feelings to the outer world, and whether they're hiding their thinking or feeling, their thoughts or feeling internally. And that's the real difference. And I don't think we can, now that we know all these subtypes, we can't really say that one is more on the feeling side or one's more on the thinking side. We actually see an equal number of subtypes of the INFJ that come to the thinking, and an equal number of subtypes from the INTJ that go to the feeling. And actually, all the T or the F really means isn't that they prefer thinking or feeling, it just means what do they show the world, and which one do they have. I'm an INTJ, so my extroverted thinking is trying to hook into other people's thought process and basically explain things in a way that they can understand. And so in this video, I'm just talking to a camera, but if we were in person, I would be doing my equivalent of what extroverted feeling types do, which is to look for cues that you understand or not. That's the extroverted thinking equivalent. Trying to see if I can detect whether you understand or not, kind of validating and verifying, do you understand? Now, for the extroverted feeling type, they're going to be seeing how you feel, and they're going to be kind of trying to get behind what you're saying and like read your body language and facial expressions and infer things about you, because they're basically trying to hook into your feeling function. They're trying to hook into it so that they can kind of really see how you feel and then share in that feeling with you. Just like with my extroverted thinking, I'm hooking into other people's thinking functions and trying to see how they think, and then starting from how they think, am I able to bridge the gap of their thinking and my thinking, and can we communicate? Can we interface, basically? So yeah, I think that's it for today. I know we kind of covered a lot of material with our review. So hopefully you're all still with me, even though we've gone through quite a lot of dichotomies and quite a lot of complexity. But I do think this is a very rewarding system. It absolutely is worth trudging through. So I hope you'll stick with me as we continue our explorations. And basically, I'm going to spend the rest of this introductory class looking at the types from Myers-Briggs perspective, bringing in a little bit of Kiersey, reading a few of John Beebe's keynotes, and so on. And my goal is really, by the end of this, we've kind of surveyed some of the intro materials. We have an understanding of Myers-Briggs type and the cognitive function stack. And ultimately, we just have a deep understanding of Jungian type, starting with Jung's four-function model and how he arrived at that and so on. So I think we're on track for this. I'm an introverted intuitive, so I'm always kind of checking and asking myself if we're on track. Do we need to hurry up? Do we need to slow down? Do we have too much material? Do we have too little material? Should I add something? Should I take something away? These are the kinds of things that the introverted intuitive is always doing. They're always kind of, it's like as I'm talking to you and as I'm teaching this class, I'm also kind of somewhere else off in my head, checking what I'm saying as I'm saying it, and then getting my impression from that and getting a sort of impressionistic sense of this is going well, this is great, or this is not going well. I need to pick it up, So I'm always kind of managing that process. But be that as it may, it'll be interesting when we get into the subtypes. We can look at more of the complexity there. I always love. It's actually a relief to me to get into that complexity. That might be something of the introverted intuitive as well, of just the real, or maybe just all IJ types have this. I think inverted sensing types also have a real appreciation for the rich complexity of the world, and not the surface thing, but wanting to go really deep. And so I think it's actually a relief for me, because the hardest part for me in teaching any of these topics is when we're so zoomed out that we have to use really general terms. And as soon as we get to the advanced, it's like I have a breath of fresh air. Like as soon as we get to the point where I can use all of the technical terms and all of the, then it's like, finally we've gotten to the level of detail that we can really work with. So it's been a little bit of a challenge, but I think a good one for me to kind of keep it at the fundamentals. And then as we go into advanced Jungian typology classes, we will be looking more deeply at the functions and the subtypes and so on. So thanks for watching, and until next time. Thank you.